A lot has been happening as far as Philippine-US relations is concerned. Over the past few months alone, the two sides have decided not to only fully implement, but also expand the parameters of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. But as they always say, the devil is in the details. After all, it's not only a question of having more security cooperation with the United States, it's also a question of the nature of security cooperation that the Philippines wants to develop with the United States under an expanded EDCA. When it comes to bilateral relationship between the United States and the Philippines, there are also a lot of gaps. One major gap is the lack of a decisive modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines despite having a century-old alliance. Moreover, throughout the past, multiple Philippine administration had concerns about lack of unequivocal support by America, categorical support by America for Philippine claims and sovereign rights in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. If you look at the trade and investment relations, it's also quite tepid. In fact, even in terms of trade and investment, bilateral relationship between the Philippines and US, well, to put it mildly, there's huge room for improvement. Countries like Vietnam have almost 10 times more exports than the Philippines to the United States. After all, we're talking about a former enemy of the United States. Countries like Singapore, for instance, and ASEAN have 30 times or 50 times more foreign direct investment stock compared to the Philippines. So the question right now is this: bilateral relationship between Philippines and US, is it moving in the right direction? Is the Biden administration committed to make comprehensive strategic partnership with the Philippines for the 21st century a reality beyond semantics, slogans, and promises? And whether President Marcos Jr. is also in the right position to get the most out of this bilateral relationship. To better understand the current state of bilateral relationship, the history of Philippine-US relationship, and the trajectory of Philippine-US relationship, not to mention what the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement could mean for the bilateral relationship, let's talk to someone who's arguably the leading American expert on US-Philippine relations, Gregory Poling. When it comes to the Philippine-US alliance, what do you think were the major problems in the past, the deficits in that alliance? Why do you think it did not deliver the way it should have? I mean, at least from an American standpoint, what is your understanding of where we went, not completely wrong, but where we went short?
Yeah. So we had the historic problem during the Cold War that the alliance was just terribly unbalanced, right? I mean, it was effectively every 5 or 10 years during the presidency of Marcos Sr., we would renegotiate the military basing agreement, and we would just decide how much security assistance and overall economic assistance do the Americans have to provide for continued, basically unhindered access to Philippine basing. That's not a sustainable alliance. It's not a partnership at all. It was a glorified rental agreement, and it was never going to be sustained after the Cold War because the politics of democratic societies once the Soviet Union fell was never going to allow that. So then we went into this period of just muddling through, treading water from the 1990s all the way, I would argue, until the last couple of years. I mean, yes, we had the cooperation around counterterrorism in the aughts, but that wasn't really an alliance in the genuine sense. The discussions we've been having over the last 2 years or so, I think it's the first time since at least the 1970s that we've really had a mature discussion about what the point of the alliance is and how it can better serve both countries.
Would you say that the Philippines' decision to file the arbitration case in the early 2010s, and of course the culmination of that later on in 2016, do you think that that was something that made you more invested as an analyst in this kind of alliance? And do you think that made the Philippines in a way special? Because it's the only country that dared to take China to international court, right? I mean, let's not forget. I know there were the Duterte years. We can talk about that later on. But people tend to forget that was audacious, right? I mean, that was something very special that the Philippines did that no one else dared. And my sense is many in Washington, D.C. and in many of our traditional partner countries were very impressed by the Philippines by that. What do you have to say about the whole arbitration saga, if I can put it that way?
It's absolutely true that the Aquino administration really did the entire region and the global community a service by filing the arbitration in 2013 and then seeing it through to the end, despite significant Chinese pressure and even a lot of hesitancy from its partners and allies in the region and the U.S. at the very beginning.
And within the Philippines also,
really
a lot
didn't
of
come
critics
around until 2015. I think that that did show a lot of folks in Washington that you had to get the Philippines right if you were going to get the South China Sea right.
Right. And did you expect that the arbitration award to culminate the way it did, with kind of an almost too sweeping victory for the Philippines? And then, of course, you had the Duterte drama. How did you, absorb that whole plot twist?
So the only question really, if you were not a lawyer in Beijing, the only question was the Ituaba question, whether or not the arbitral tribunal would find that Ituaba, the biggest of the Spratlys,
Right.
naturally is a habitable island.
You were there,
Fully
right? You visited that, right?
That's right. Yeah. So in 2015, you might remember China didn't participate in the case, but the
Right.
Taiwanese government, the then KMT government, tried very hard to influence the outcome of the decision because they occupy Ituaba. So they flew me and a Philippine
Right.
journalist, and then later a bunch of Western journalists out to Ituaba, had us drink the water and eat the vegetables. And they brought me back to Taipei and they said, okay, we're going to have a press conference. And I said, okay, but I'm still not going to say it's an island. And they said, okay, you can skip the press conference.
Right.
So, I mean, that was the only question. By the time the tribunal ruled that they had jurisdiction, which
Right.
came at the end of 2015, it was clear that the Philippines was going to win. It was only a matter of how much it would win.
And do you think the arbitration award still makes sense? Because there are a lot of people saying, wow, that was just symbolic. Look at it. China's not done anything about it. I mean, obviously, I disagree with that. I always say, I haven't heard China using the term 9-dash line anymore since it came out because it's a joke. I see America invoking the arbitration award of the Philippines to essentially provide a legal justification for its FONOPS operations. So for me, my understanding, there's a lot of benefits. What is your understanding of that? Did it have any value at all in retrospect, despite the Duterte interlude?
Yeah, look, it had enormous value. It not just to the Philippines, but to all of the claims to South China Sea and broadly to the international legal community, right? It clarified fundamental parts of international law and it made clear that China is not above the law. It also gave the Philippines the ability to leverage countries like the US and the UK and Australia and Japan, make very clear that there's a blueprint for what is Philippine waters and what is not. And those countries on the outside who stand for international law have to therefore stand for Philippine rights and Philippine waters. The problem with the arbitration is not the case. The problem was the Duterte administration. The Duterte administration decided not to pursue the case, didn't seek to impose any diplomatic or economic cost on China for its non-compliance. And so Beijing got off scot-free. If you're not going to impose any cost on the party that loses, then of course it's going to look like the arbitration didn't do any good.
But it looks like in spite of the Duterte interlude, we still nevertheless saw the arbitration award of the Philippines being invoked, not only by our traditional partners, but you have Vietnam, you have Malaysia, you have Indonesia. Many countries in the region in one way or another would invoke it, especially when, of course, it served their own purpose, right?
Yeah, look, just last week at the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Japan,
Right.
the G7 foreign ministers called for compliance with the ruling for the first time. That's the first time that France or Italy have ever called on China to comply for the ruling. So it still is out there. A coalition still exists, and it is slowly growing. The difficulty for the Philippines is that the whole world was watching on July 12th, 2016. You had over 50 countries that had gone on the record saying that they would support it. And then the Duterte government didn't come back and ask them to. And so that coalition fell apart. Now, all these years later, it's much more difficult work to piece that coalition back together.
The momentum.
Take a while.
Yeah, I mean, the whole coalition around the arbitration thing is eerily familiar to me when I saw the response to the Ukraine crisis, right? I know there are two different conflicts in many ways. I'm not drawing, I'm not saying they're morally equal or geopolitically equal, but I mean, on the Ukraine issue, right, it was also very hard to get a lot of developing countries to side with Ukraine or to condemn the Russia situation. So in the arbitration case, we had China flexing its muscle, diplomatic muscle, economic muscle, to dissuade a lot of developing countries to stand by the Philippines. And then here on Ukraine, we see a similar case, right? Russia is flexing its muscle together with other countries and preventing more expression of solidarity. Do you see that kind of parallelism? Because I sense that as a Filipino, as someone who's also very much invested in following what's happening in Ukraine. This notion of, hey, you're talking about Ukraine, Philippines, two post-colonial countries being bullied essentially by bigger imperialist powers. I mean, you could put it that way, right? And yet You're not getting as much love and support from the rest of the developing world, global south, whatever you want to look at it, whatever you want to call them. Do you see that kind of parallel, or did that also come to your mind?
I think we can overstate it. Ukraine is obviously a unique situation, but you're right that the Philippines had far more support from Europe, Japan, the US, Australia, those you would expect. The only support China had in 2016 came basically from the Arab League, a single Arab League statement. Southeast Asia, parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America were up for grabs. So it's not clear what the maximum ceiling on Philippine support is, but it's not going to be the global South. And it's certainly not going to be the Arab world, it would seem. But you also don't need unanimity. There is significant cost that gets imposed on Russia today because it's seen as a rogue state, even if some countries aren't willing to go on the record saying that. And there would be significant cost to China if it were seen the same way.
I want to push you on this issue. Let's do a counterfactual. Let's say we did not have someone like Duterte in 2016 in the Philippines. We had someone more traditional, let's say not Aquino level, but someone closer to the current president in the Philippines, right? Who wants to have reasonably good relationship with China, but who also wants to make the red lines clear. Can you lay out to us what would that scenario look like had a Duterte not happened? Are we looking at taking the case to United Nations General Assembly? Are we looking at what? Parallel arbitration cases by other countries? Because my sense, Greg, is that scenario was not discussed as much because Duterte was just eating the whole oxygen in the room, right? We were talking about everything else Duterte was doing. But I always ask at the back of my head, but what would we have done? How effective would we have been had someone like Duterte not been the Philippine president back then? On the arbitration case in particular, of course, yeah.
Yeah, so remember on July 12th, 2016, 5 countries called for China to comply with the ruling. The Philippines was not one of them. The Philippines didn't call for compliance with the ruling until October of 2016. Yeah. So that sucked all of the oxygen out of this coalition that formed earlier that year to try to push China. So in an alternate universe, you would have had 50 countries representing the majority of global GDP come out the week of the arbitration and say, it's out there, it's legally binding, we demand China comply. China would have said no. A month later, the Philippines probably would have gone back to the tribunal as required by UNCLOS and said, China's not complying with the ruling, we need further steps. That process would have continued to embarrass Beijing. So it would have gone on, and eventually the Philippines would have gone to the UN General Assembly, like Mauritius did for the UK a couple years ago on the Chagos Archipelago issue, or like Nicaragua famously did to the Reagan administration on our support for the Contra-rebels. And the UN General Assembly would have had to vote on a non-binding resolution that, again, would have been a huge embarrassment to China. And what you'll hear, what you heard during the Duterte administration, particularly when former Secretary Locsin was then the representative to the UN, was that the Philippines didn't have the vote, so it wasn't worth bringing it to the UN. Well, one, I don't know if that's true. I don't think that that's been tested. But two, the Philippines would have had a much easier time getting those votes in 2016. It's much harder to come back 4 or 5 years later after not having talked about it.
So there was a damage done, right? I mean, I just want to be clear about it, that there was indeed a strategic cost for the Philippines by President Duterte overemphasizing the need for what he called soft landing, right? I remember very well. And you had Secretary Yasay, the late Yasay, also almost tortured when he had to discuss about this very delicate situation for the Philippines. We know very well that not long before the arbitration award came out in 2016, we remember this very well, China was conducting military exercises. I think some of them were close to the Scarborough Shoal. I think a nuclear-capable bomber plane was passed through the area. So clearly the Chinese were intimidating the Philippines fully. But this is also the years before the United States also was unequivocal about the parameters of the Mutual Defense Treaty when it comes to the South China Sea disputes, right? I mean, my sense, it was really during the Trump years, especially 2018-19 onwards, that we saw the clarification and the parameters coming in. I mean, you're free to disagree with me, but my sense was in 2016, I'm not justifying what Duterte did, but I kind of also understand why they were iffy about going gung-ho in asserting this, because they also felt they didn't have the full backing of the US back then if things go really south. Not to mention the Philippines didn't have enough of capabilities on its own to stand up to China. What do you say to that argument, at least? That, we were not sure about America 100%. Look at what they did in Scarborough Shoal. Not much, supposedly. So therefore, you should understand why Duterte was going for quote-unquote soft landing. What is your argument on that?
That the U.S. screwed up, but the U.S. isn't the only one that screwed up. The U.S., there is a lot of blame that can go around, whether we're talking about who failed at Scarborough Shoal or what happened at the beginning of the Duterte presidency. There's a tendency for finger pointing. Yes, the U.S. should have had a much clearer response to the Scarborough Shoal crisis in 2012. The Aquino government should have had a much clearer response as well. Both were taken aback because I don't think either Washington or Manila really understood or was willing to believe just how aggressive Beijing was going to get. There was an assumption that we wanted to de-escalate, so the Chinese must want to de-escalate too, and Beijing was able to take advantage of that. By the time you get to the Duterte administration, I don't think that Scarborough had anything to do with Duterte's decision to set aside the arbitral award or to go to Beijing in October 2016 and make that infamous speech about aligning the Philippines and China's ideological flow. That was Duterte from his college days. But he did use it as an
You mean his ideological antipathy towards
I think he's ideologically anti-American, and that was always going to be the path that the Duterte presidency took, at least at the beginning. But there were plenty of other Filipinos who did have legitimate worries about American reliability, and Duterte was able to play on that. The U.S. should have made the clarification that came in 2019 when then Secretary Pompeo landed on the tarmac in Manila. That should have come years before. Now, internally, as my book talks about, that was largely the position of the U.S. government since 1979, and very clearly since 1998. The lawyers in the State Department held back on the clarification for far too long, and I don't think that the American side appreciated how much the narrative mattered, right? That they, even if they were legally in the right, they were losing the rhetorical battle, and that's what mattered.
Not to mention sloppy terms, and I remember Obama using the term a bunch of rocks, right? To refer to Scarborough Shoal and Philippine claims when he was here in Manila, just hours after we signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, something that we'll discuss very shortly. You have a book on dangerous grounds, which is a fantastic book. Did this whole drama, the whole South China Sea drama, I mean, the whole arbitration drama, the deficits on the part of U.S. in terms of its commitment, how much of that was the passion behind this book? Because as someone who has written a book, I know it's not easy to write a book. It's really you have to really give your heart and soul. Can you tell us a little bit also about your book and the circumstances of your book? Because it's not like there's a shortage of book on maritime disputes in the region. Why did you feel you have to write this book?
So I started at the end of 2018. I guess there was two reasons. One, there really was no good general primer, a 101 history of the South China Sea since Bill Hayden's in 2014. So the island building, the arbitration, none of that was in there. You had pieces of it, like Marita's Veto is rock solid. You had selections, but no kind of general introduction to the South China Sea. So that's where I started. But then once I got into it, it very quickly became clear to me that the real purpose of the book was to clarify for an American audience why the South China Sea matters to the U.S. at all. And that had to be told as three stories at once. The story of the South China Sea, the story of the U.S.-Philippines alliance from its earliest days, and then the story of UNCLOS and the negotiation of modern international law.
Yeah, so how do you feel about the direction of the bilateral relations in recent months?
Yeah, I don't want to be naive, and there is going to be challenges ahead. This could always stumble, fall apart, but the momentum, the progress that's been made over really the last 2 years or 18 months has been remarkable. Starting from probably the bilateral strategic dialogue in November 2011, when you had the two countries issue a joint vision statement, which lays out goals for alliance modernization and a clear checklist. They've been moving through that checklist in a way that's pretty rare for these kind of high-level statements. So increased U.S. support to Armed Forces of the Philippines modernization. The U.S. gave $100 million additional foreign military financing last year. During President Marcos's visit to Washington, they announced that the U.S. is transferring new defense equipment, including C-130s and patrol vessels. We've launched a new maritime security framework, the Bantay Dagat framework, to talk about China's gray zone coercion, the militia and the Coast Guard. They have released new bilateral defense guidelines during President Marcos's visit, which it's pretty remarkable that that hasn't happened since 1951. We've been allies for all these years, and we've never had this kind of operating manual for the alliance, which the guidelines really are the bones of the alliance. It's what makes it sustainable and implementable. We've done that 3 times with Japan. We're just now doing it with with the Philippines, and on and on. They continue to announce new progress. EDCA, of course, we can talk about, but all of this, of course, it has to be implemented, but it shows the two sides really taking each other seriously for the first time, and doing so in such a remarkably short amount of time.
Right. I mean, obviously, this is like the software, right? You have to update the software of the alliance to make it more in tune with the needs of the time. And I think even President Marcos Jr. said the need for evolution of the alliance is there. We'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But again, I need to really go back to the Duterte era, because one argument I'm hearing, including from people who are working also in the current administration and used to work in the previous administration, this is how the argument goes, Greg, and tell me what you think about it. The argument is, you essentially needed, almost in a kind of a Lacanian, Freudian way, like you needed the shock of Duterte so that the U.S. will take the Philippines more seriously. And thanks to Duterte, now Marcos Jr. can deal with America from a better position of bargaining position or something along those lines. What do you say about that kind of argument? Because many would say, actually, Duterte maybe had some intentions here which were not too bad. He did maybe some good things, but some would say he was actually more net negative than net positive. But as I said, there's other side will say, no. We needed the Duterte shock to make the alliance be taken more seriously by Washington, and so that Marcos can push it to a new level. What do you think about that?
Look, there's some truth to that, but it's also a little bit dishonest to claim that somehow the Duterte administration deserves credit because their policies didn't work. And so as a result, the Marcos administration has to do the exact opposite. This was not Duterte's intent, right? This is like my 5-year-old running into the house, breaking the TV, and then a week later saying, hey, it's nice that we got that new TV, huh? Yeah, but that's not what you were trying to do. You just broke the TV. Look, the Duterte administration clearly did two things that have been unintended benefits to the US-Philippine
Alliance. Right, the unintended consequences. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So one, I think they scared the professional bureaucracy in both countries.
Interesting.
Both countries, not just in the US, but in the Philippines. In the same way that the Trump administration did, right? Kind of the wild, whipsawing way they made policy, the unpredictability scared everybody. So now we've got this effort to put all of these institutions inside the Mutual Defense Treaty and the alliance so that it will be more resilient. And so there are very clear, guidelines to implement it. And then two, Duterte bent over backwards for Beijing, and he got very little in return. And that had the perverse effect of solidifying the strategic consensus within Manila that China is a threat. And that there's not, because if Duterte wasn't good enough, no Philippine president will ever be good enough for China.
Exactly.
And therefore, the only option is deterrence. And to deter, it means a closer alliance with the US, modernization of the AFP, and also this proliferation of other relationships with the Japanese and the Australians and other ASEAN members. So by failing so spectacularly, Duterte has proven what actually needs to be done.
But I would say the failure was also China's to a great degree, right? Had China actually made the most of that bilateral relationship in a real mutually beneficial way, if they really invested in the Philippines, they really gave us concessions, made the situation less horrible in the South China Sea, I think we would have had a different conversation. But, Marcos Jr. comes in and he doesn't really have much to show as far as Duterte's pivot to China is concerned. Are you surprised that China, tried to have the Philippines on the cheap during the Duterte years?
Yeah, I am.
I'll just be brutally honest. Yeah, I think that we use that in different... Yeah, my sense is they wanted to have the Philippines on the chip, and it's not going to work, especially you're dealing with the Marcoses.
If China had just done two things, right? If China had actually delivered even half of the $30+ billion in aid and investment that they promised, that probably would have been enough. And if they had laid off just a little bit on the pressure around Scarborough Shoal, if they had dialed back the militia deployments, if they had stopped the blockades of Ayungin Shoal, but they didn't do any of it. I mean, the degree of disrespect showed just how little concern China has about its smaller neighbors in general and the Philippines in particular, because clearly President Duterte went to Beijing 5 times in 6 years. And President Xi visited Manila once. And despite all of that nicety, at the end of the day, China wasn't willing to put in even a little energy to leverage the Philippines away from the alliance with the Americans and give Duterte the space, the political space he would have needed in Manila to really get that done.
And for Marcos Jr. also to argue that there's a value to this relationship, right? I mean, I mean, you were also an analyst of China. My understanding is that you were first a China analyst before expanded to ASEAN and the South China Sea issue. Are you surprised by how China? Let's be honest. They lost. I mean, there should have a debate in Beijing. How did we lose the Philippines? Right? I think that should be their debate today.
They should. I don't think that there's that much self-reflection within the government of China today. I mean, I'm sure within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs they wonder, but at the end of the day, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China doesn't really have much power over policymaking, right? They're not like the State Department or BFA. And so the only people that matter are in Zhongnanhai around Xi Jinping, and clearly they're not all that consumed by worries about what smaller powers think. I think this is partially the bureaucratic culture within Chinese government decision making. Within China's worldview, the only poles in the system that matter are China, the US, Russia, maybe Japan and the UK, and nothing else matters. And look, I mean, the US has certainly done a fair amount of that itself over the years, but I think has gotten much better, at least under the Biden administration. But I think in general is much better at recognizing that it needs to cultivate its partnerships and alliances in a real way, with a little more respect, that we do live in a multipolar world now. And China hasn't seemed to have gotten that message.
Now let's go to the Marcos Jr. administration. Are you surprised by the velocity of seeming shift, or call it restoration, that is happening as far as the Philippine-US alliance is concerned?
I've been surprised by the speed, yes. I mean, during the election, my interpretation, I think interpreting the U.S. government, was that a Marcos Jr. government was going to be far easier to work with than the Duterte government. And that even though we didn't know all of Marcos's positions on some of these things, he hadn't said anything to the famous like jet ski statements from Duterte during the presidential election 2016. Marcos was much more even-keeled. And more importantly, because of the way he built the coalition, the Uniteam, he was going to inherently be a conservative with a small c president. Duterte came in as a populist. Marcos didn't. Marcos came in at the head of a very broad coalition of established factions. So he was going to have to be more in line with the consensus, the elite consensus, and the public consensus within Manila. And by 2022, that consensus was extremely anti-China and shifting very rapidly pro-American. So we expected some of this. I didn't expect it to be embraced as wholeheartely as it has been. And I think a lot of that speaks to the technocratic nature of the cabinet that Marcos has built around him. He's got professionals who have been in government for decades who have watched China for they don't need to relearn the lessons.
They don't need to read you and I. They don't need to read us.
They do not need to come ask us if China's going to play nice. They already know the answer.
No, I mean, this thing about Marcos Jr., I mean, I'll push it a little bit. Don't you think there was also the aspect of Biden charm offensive that did also the magic here? I mean, my sense is Marcos was a bit iffy about how would America, especially a Democratic administration, the whole democracy summit, democracy promotion, plus the fact that the Marcoses have pending cases in the U.S. courts. We're talking about huge cases. Don't you think that when the Sherman coming to Manila, talking about sovereign immunity, Biden chumming up with Marcos, don't you think that was also an important factor? And do you think that Biden should get credit for that?
It does matter. I mean, I think the shift would have happened either way. But yes, clearly the Biden administration seized the opportunity when it was presented and did it in the right way. Biden was the first foreign leader to call Marcos after the election and congratulate
according to Marcos, right? But is that confirmed?
That's what the US
that's what Marcos said.
Well.
I don't know about the other side. Look,
can I guarantee that the Sultan of Brunei didn't call first and they're both not talking about it? I can't guarantee that.
Let's check the logbooks.
But he clearly called before the Chinese ambassador got there, which was the important thing. But yeah, look, this gets back to something I said earlier about the way the alliance has been modernized. It's the U.S. is taking the Marcos government seriously in a way that, honestly, they didn't even take Aquino seriously at times.
Yes, I mean, thanks for saying that.
They recognize that if they want the alliance to modernize and to work for both sides, then they need to, show a degree of respect, that the Philippines is and equal partner in this decision making. And that's the way that they treat the Japanese. It's the way that the Americans treat the Koreans.
Yeah.
It's about time that we treat the Philippines the same way.
Right. That's very important to talk about. Now, obviously, recently we had the biggest Balikatan exercises just coming after the EDCA. And not only the full implementation of EDCA, but the expansion of EDCA. What is your understanding of the expansion of EDCA? As far as we know, there's still details being hatched out in terms of how many American troops will be in some of these quote-unquote sites, what kind of weapon systems they're going to put there. What is your understanding? How massive and how potentially provocative or effective in terms of deterrence the American presence is going to be in the Philippines under EDCA in the coming years?
Yeah. I don't have all the answers. None of us do. And that's because EDCA is supposed to be flexible, right? So they're going to be negotiating this in perpetuity every year.
Right.
What do we want to use these sites for? What do we bring in? So it's not like, it's not a base. It's not, U.S. permanent basing. It's not even like what we do in Northern Australia, where we had a set number, 2,500 Marines are going to rotate through Darwin. This is going to be much more flexible, and it's going to be negotiated continuously, with the Philippines having a veto on everything, which again is necessary. This is the way a modern alliance has to work. The priorities are pretty clear. I mean, and the priority is the South China Sea specifically, and modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines in general, right? That's what EDCA is supposed to do. So the Americans build things, that becomes AFP infrastructure. The Americans come in, they train, that becomes capacity building for the AFP. In the meantime, the Americans can be there to help plug gaps. As the AFP develops capabilities, which will be a long-term process, the Americans can rotate in platforms to help fill those missions. And most of those missions are going to be maritime security focused. Of the 9 EDCA sites now, 7 of them clearly have nothing to do with Taiwan, despite that being the only thing anybody wants to talk about. EDCA is still about the South China Sea first and foremost. And while it's there focused on maritime security, it also has huge benefits for, of course, HADR and counter-terror missions, because by modernizing the AFP becomes better at all of this.
You nonetheless have 2 sites in Cagayan and 1 in Isabela, which is, well, it's not next to Taiwan, but it's in the northernmost provinces of the Philippines. So clearly there is an aspect of the Taiwan tensions here, right? I mean, so what do you say about people are saying this is maybe a tad too provocative towards China? How do we make sure that this is more about deterrence, effective deterrence and preparation rather than provocation of China? Or this provocation, maybe this is just a Chinese gaslighting that is blaming the Philippines and other countries for preparing against possible invasion by China of Taiwan? What is your take of this issue?
So first, a minor point, we can quibble, but everybody likes to say 3 sites in Northern Luzon. The site in Isabela is an army base. It doesn't, there's no...
Right, I wanted to see,
I mean, could it evolve? Sure. But for now, the only 2 sites that have anything to do with maritime security in the north are the 2 in Cagayan. And might those play a role someday in a Taiwan crisis? Maybe. What you hear AFP officials saying, and I believe them, is that for now, the goal is to strengthen the Philippines' ability to patrol and monitor and respond to crises in the Luzon Straits. Because for the Philippines, rising tensions around Taiwan are a direct national security threat. The coast of Luzon is 200 miles away. The Philippines has very little investment in Northern Luzon when it comes to the Navy and the Air Force, very little ability to monitor anything that's going on up there. If a crisis erupts over Taiwan, the Philippines is going to be facing, 1, the problem of 200,000 OFWs in Taiwan they can't get out, and 2, a potential refugee crisis, given the flow of people from Taiwan, and the AFP can't even monitor it. So there's very good and reasonable reasons for the AFP to want to modernize naval capabilities and air capabilities in Northern Luzon.
And of course, not to mention the Benham Rise and the whole Philippine Sea and Western Pacific, right? The Philippines has a huge extended continental shelf there. I'm surprised not many people are talking about that. And it's not like the Philippines has huge presence there. I mean, we're still catching up in the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, but there's a lot still to protect there, right? I mean, last time I checked, the Chinese second island chain, so-called second island chain, cuts way into the Philippine Sea. So the Philippines should not be only worried about Taiwan and South China Sea, but also in the Philippine Sea and Benham Rise. Do you think that those sites could be helpful also to Philippines developing, let's say, domain awareness and some sort of response capability there?
I think that the capacity building part of this, the modernization of the AFP, helps across the country, right? So lessons learned in one theater get transferred to another. And the AFP is overinvested in Mindanao and the West Philippine Sea when it comes to the Navy and the Coast Guard. There's relatively little maritime domain awareness and patrol capabilities in the north or in the east. And I do think that this is, I mean, in all likelihood, these 9 sites are not the end of EDCA. The AFP will come to the Americans year after year and say, we would also like you to add a site in, another one in the side. We would like to add a site on the West Coast. So I understand why the two in Cagayan are sensitive. I think there's reasonable questions being raised. Of course, the Americans, if 10 years from now there's a crisis over Taiwan, the Americans are going to say, hey, can we use those 2 sites for surveillance? And then the Philippines will have to have a debate. But why does the AFP want them? It's not because the AFP is preparing to take part in the Taiwan fight. It's because they need to build up capabilities in the north, just like they need to build them up everywhere else in the country.
After dozens of articles and writings on EDCA, a lot of interviews, a lot of discussion with people from across the spectrum, for me, it really comes down to this, right? What is the Goldilocks level of EDCA and US-Philippine strategic cooperation that we should aim for in order to make sure that there's enough deterrence and preparation, but not too much of provocation, right? I mean, that's my understanding. Now, having said that, for you, what is that Goldilocks level? Like, given the current state of affairs, of course, things are fluid, they can move. But as things stand today, what do you think is the Goldilocks level of, how deep and how far should the EDCA exercises or Balikatan exercise, those things go?
In a perfect world, over the next 5 years, we will see more and more U.S. patrol aircraft taking off from Basa and Antonio Bautista Air Base, operating mainly over the West Philippine Sea alongside Philippine aircraft, to enhance surveillance and deterrence. We will see more pre-positioning of equipment that both parties can use for the West Philippine Sea mission. We'll see the Americans building basic needs, lengthening and hardening the runways, building more fuel storage, building more radar facilities. And then down the line, we will see, I would hope, U.S. Marine fire teams alongside Philippine Marine fire teams practicing with, BrahMos missiles on the Philippine side and Tomahawks and naval strike missiles on the American side to help strengthen Philippine deterrence. Nowhere in there did I say that I expect to see large numbers of U.S. combat aircraft in Northern Luzon prepping for a Taiwan contingency, because I just don't think that that's a viable option. I don't think it's something the Philippines would accept. I don't think it matters really in the Taiwan fight. It's not enough facilities to really make a big difference.
And U.S. can live with that. And U.S. can live with that. The reason I'm raising this, Greg, is because we have a lot of friends in the Philippines, especially from political left, among others, who say, no, the Americans, you give them an inch, they go for the whole thing, right? They want to put all their big weapons there. They want to make huge storage facilities. They want to prepare for the big war with China over Taiwan. So you're saying that doesn't make sense. Just the logistics of it, just the political predilection of the Philippines with, sensitivity about having Americans. Not to mention it's illegal to have, permanent American base in the Philippines, right? So you're saying that's paranoia. Yeah. That's not going to happen.
I think it's perfectly fine for Filipinos to ask questions,
worry about their sovereignty.
Audits here. They want to know what's going to go into the bases. And I think over time, what will make people more comfortable with EDCA is when they see that this really is different. This is not the 1947 military bases agreement. The Americans have no say in what happens on these facilities except what the AFP gives them, right? The Philippine military and B&D is in charge. The Americans are guests. And as people see that that is really true, I think they will grow more and more comfortable and EDCA will expand. So the key for the AFP and the US is to try to assuage the critics right now and just implement the agreement and then call in the cameras and say, see, we told you so. These are Philippine bases. The Americans are building what we want and what we need.
Right. Speaking of the Balikatan exercise, the one that we had this year, this was the biggest, right? 17,600 at some point. Even Marcos attended it at some point. We had huge drills and exercises, Patriot missile systems, HIMARS, so on and so forth. Not only in Balikatan, but also the earlier army exercise between Philippines and US. What's going on there? Because one thing I keep on hearing there is lessons from Ukraine are now being applied there, right? What is your reading of the shifting nature, not only the size of these exercises between the Philippines and US? Not to mention participation of Japan, participation of Australia, and observation from observers also from United Kingdom, among others.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, kind of the wave tops, is the symbolism. So they made sure they added just enough troops to say it was the largest ever. Not significantly more than past, but just enough to say it's the largest ever. They added more observers. So the Australians had 110, I think, who took part. Everybody else was an observer. The Japanese, the Koreans, the Brits, the French, the Italians. I think several ASEAN states sent observers. All of that was about symbolism, sending messages. So on the one hand, it's the message that the alliance is modernizing. On the other, it's the message that, but the Philippines is committed to a multipolar foreign policy. Beneath that, what really matters about Balikatan is the training and the capacity building. The word that you hear Officer in Charge Galvez and Secretary Alston say over and over and over is interoperability. For the alliance to work, we need to be more interoperable. And that's something that's never happened because in the past, the US-Philippine Alliance was terribly unequal and unbalanced, and the US didn't do a lot of joint activity with the Philippine troops. The US just used Philippine land. We need to be interoperable in the way the US and Iraq are. Sorry, the US and the Korean Army is, the US and Japan are. And so Balikatan is extremely useful in that front.
Thank you very much, Gregory Poling, joining us from Washington, D.C. Gregory Poling, of course, is the director of the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative, author of the new fantastic book on Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea, and, of course, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Thank you very much, Greg. We hope to catch you again soon, as I suppose this velocity is going to keep on continuing for the foreseeable future.
Fingers crossed. So thank you so much, Richard.
Pleasure, as always. Catch us again next week here on One News. You may also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. I'm Richard Heydarian, and that is The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.